Hey everyone, this is Moderate Rebels, and I'm Ben Norton. My co-host Max Blumenthal and I had a live stream discussion with friend of the show and our colleague at the Gray Zone, Aaron Maté, and we were also joined by another friend of the show, Ajit Singh, who has done really groundbreaking original investigative reporting for the Gray Zone with us on China and the new Cold War, looking at a lot of this propaganda, picking apart the Western propaganda that is at the heart of the new Cold War on Beijing, and specifically looking at this ridiculous disinformation campaign targeting the Uyghur Muslim population in China's Xinjiang province, and how there's so many lies and half-truths and distortions that have culminated in Western governments accusing China of genocide, which is absolutely preposterous. Even, as we talk about in this segment, even the Biden State Department lawyers have internally admitted there's not actual evidence to accuse China formally, legally, of genocide. But this propaganda is much too useful to the new Cold Warriors and this new policy of trying to prevent China's economic rise. And eventually, the goal is to balkanize China, like NATO did to Yugoslavia, like the Western powers did. They want to carve up China and balkanize it on ethno-sectarian lines, creating an independent Xinjiang called Turkestan, which would be an Israel-style Islamist regime. They also are supporting, in addition to supporting, as we talk about, Uighur separatists who are extremists and far-right Trump lovers. The U.S. government has also been supporting for many decades Tibetan secessionists to try to balkanize China and create an independent Tibet. So we talk about the propaganda and the lies of the new Cold War. This is one part of our live stream discussion. We also have other segments on the Western dirty war on Syria and the horrible, devastating effects of Western sanctions on the civilian population of Syria. And we have another segment on the hawks in the Biden camp and on regime changers in academia. So definitely check out those other parts. And this is our interview with Ajit Singh and Aaron Maté.
It's important to cover the China issue because that's the new chosen evildoer of our time. And there is a fairly new poll out by Gallup, finds that there is a new high in perceptions of China as the U.S.'s greatest enemy. And, only a few years ago, most Americans viewed China favorably. I think 2018. In February 2020, only 22% of Americans viewed China as the greatest enemy. There was no clear consensus in the U.S. at that point on who the greatest enemy is. Now it's clearly China, and negative views of Russia have gone up. I think 3 out of 4 Americans see China and Russia in a very negative light now, which has gone up enormously in the past few years. So propaganda works. And the propaganda that we've been hearing most about China is very clever. It is designed to appeal to liberal sensibilities because it's much easier to get Republicans and the pro-Trump MAGA base on board with a campaign to demonize foreigners. And as I mentioned on a previous live stream, like being at the Capitol on January 6th, what I heard more than racist rhetoric or even anti-immigrant rhetoric per se, although it fits within the framework of anti-immigrant rhetoric, was anti-China rhetoric from the people storming the Capitol, to the point where they were even calling like DC police and Capitol police CCP police. So that was easy, but getting the liberals on board's been, it's a little bit different, a little bit tougher because, liberals want to be sensitive about being racist, or, they try to at least present themselves as, tolerant enough to look in the mirror and put like stickers on their cars that say "fight hate." But the narrative focuses on the human rights situation, specifically in Western China. This has gotten the most traction, more than Hong Kong. And it's about Uyghurs being put in concentration camps. It's It's about Uyghurs not only being put into forced labor, but Uyghurs being forced to pick cotton like slaves, which is just a really ironic accusation coming from the US. And Ajit Singh, who is a journalist and researcher and lawyer based in Toronto, has been really effective at picking these narratives apart. And as he's picked these narratives apart, me and Ben have partnered with Ajit on several articles and, you know, written our own articles. We've been getting denounced by more and more mainstream institutions. There was an attack on us in the Wall Street Journal 2 days ago, an attack on the Gray Zone. The South China Morning Post featured an attack on us the same day. And the Australian Strategic and Policy Institute, which is this State Department and arms industry funded think tank that pushes a lot of this narrative about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. They did an entire study on us, where, as with the Syrian open letter and the Ecuador open letter, no one disputes one single fact that we published. Nothing we published is ever disputed. What we're attacked for in this study, where we're mentioned something like 36 times, the Gray Zones mentions 36 times, is who retweets us, because Chinese officials have retweeted some of our articles. So that's apparently a real crime and some fault of ours. I don't know if Ajit's there, but it would be great to get him in to talk about this. And his latest piece is really shocking because he goes into the elements behind the recent heckling of an anti-racist rally in Washington against anti-Asian hate crimes by the Uyghur American Association, which is a US-funded Uyghur association that operates under the umbrella of the World Uyghur Congress, which is the main international Uyghur separatist organization. And they ran this, I don't know if Ben, you have the video you can show, but they ran this car caravan like right in front of this rally screaming, "Wipe out China," and just like denouncing these protesters. And the rally wasn't even about supporting China. So Ajit showed that, you know, that this group is deeply invested in far-right Trumpist politics, and their leadership operates a militia-style gun club that trains with former special forces in advanced combat techniques in Northern Virginia. So I would love to get him in here to talk about it if he's
here. Yeah.
Welcome, Ajit.
Hey, Ajit.
In the
Can you hear
building.
us?
Yep.
Right on. So, yeah, Ajit, yeah, we've been getting it. We got attacked last year like 4 times. It was obviously a State Department coordinated attack because one of the first publications to attack us was Coda Story, which is funded by the State Department and the National Endowment for Democracy in a semi-covert fashion. And then Bethany Allen Abrahamian, who's like this pal of Trump's kind of China media guy, Matt Pottinger. She chimed in at Axios. I found other attacks on us, but it was coordinated, and it was partly because of the work you were doing, starting with an article, which is consistently one of our most popular articles, because I think so many people out there are questioning this narrative and wondering what the hell is going on, where you busted the claim by Adrian Zenz that over 1 million Uyghurs were in concentration camps in Xinjiang, and you went through his report and you showed who Adrian Zenz really was. So, I mean, let's start by talking about the centrality of this figure, Adrian Zenz, in the narrative, and how you got into ripping apart his studies. I worked with you on this. I questioned Zenz on Capitol Hill.
Like about 3-4 years ago, the sort of media reporting around Xinjiang started increasing in like the sharpness of the tone and depiction of what was going on there. And then seemingly out of nowhere popped up this former professor at a seminary in Germany who was starting to be quoted in piece after piece by like the Associated Press, New York Times, Washington Post as the sort of key headlining expert who's somehow who's like terrific scholarship is revealing atrocities in Xinjiang. And so looking into some of his background and who this person was, like for those of us on the left, seeing his affiliation with with think tanks like the Jamestown Foundation and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation sort of raises your attention. But then going into him,
who are they?
Sorry,
who are they? Jamestown and Victims.
Oh, Jamestown was founded, I believe. It was linked with William Casey.
Yeah, it was founded out of
80s.
Bill Casey's CIA in the Reagan administration as a way of paying Soviet dissidents without doing it directly through the CIA.
Yeah, and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, I think, was established in the early 90s by the U.S. government. And it's, as Max outlined in the piece we collaborated on, Zenz, it has a lot of roots in the sort of ultra-nationalist, anti-communist sort of forces in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. So, yeah, basically, you saw these claims being trotted around repeatedly and just accepted uncritically, and tried to look into that. And it was even surprising from my perspective, like the sort of lack of like strength behind the claims. So the two sources that have been now, like at this point, like the reporting is so circular that sources are just recycled and recycled and recycled, that it's just this sort of number that floats in the air that's just accepted. And it's like untethered from these people, I think, in most people's minds. But the actual like hard copy sort of foundation for these claims are a report by the Network of Chinese Human Rights Defenders, which is funded by the NED, and it features a lot of anti-communist Chinese dissidents.
Let's just explain like what the NED is. That's the National Endowment for Democracy.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the National Endowment for Democracy, which has like a long history of basically, in the words of its own sort of founding members, doing what the CIA did covertly, openly. And basically what it does is it funds a lot of sort of civil society or NGO groups that are promoting things that seem like very good, like democracy and human rights, but it's really a way for the United States government to funnel resources towards groups that advance the interests of U.S. foreign policy. A lot of these groups often support right-wing neoliberal economic policies and whatnot. So the NED was the financier of the one sort of human rights organization which is based in the United States, the Network of Chinese Human Rights Defenders. And when you look at that study, which was cited by the US representative on the UN Human Rights Council, Gay McDougall, in 2018, and then that sort of started the chain of reports which said the UN reports that China's detaining 1 million Uyghurs. And Ben and I wrote about that in 2018 to say that it wasn't the UN that said it, it was the US representative, and she was relying on these two people. So if you look at the Network of Chinese Human Rights Defenders, the basis of their claim, like the issue of genocide and discrimination is extremely serious. And if we are concerned about it genuinely, we should be extremely serious in how we verify those claims. So the Network of Chinese Human Rights Defenders did the extremely diligent, hard work of interviewing a total of 8 people. And then it averaged their estimates to come up with, which it then multiplied by the entire region's population. So like if Max said, yeah, I think 10% of Uyghurs are detained, and Aaron says, I think 15, and Ben says 12, they just averaged that and multiplied it by Xinjiang's provincial or the region's population. And that's how they got to their figure. And they say this right in their report, as you can see on the screen. And then the other fellow is Adrian Zenz. And if you look at his work before getting into his background, just on the basis of his work, he cites a Newsweek Japan report as claiming to have come across leaked Chinese government documents, which state, I believe, the number that he said in his initial report. Like subsequently, he's increased his estimates over time. I think it's like 800,000. And so if you look at that Newsweek Japan report that Zenz cites, it's based on this exiled Uyghur television network based in Turkey, which if we have an opportunity to talk about later, Turkey is sort of the foundation of the sort of international exiled Uyghur community. And this network features people like, as you see on the screen, Nureddin Yildiz, who goes on the network ranting and raving these fanatically anti-Semitic rants, saying that China's a nation of savages worse than the Jews. And this is the basis of Zen's estimate. So these are the two really incredibly solid sources for this extremely incendiary claim that has so many consequences in terms of international politics. And it's laughable. It's like hard to really put into words how ridiculous this is. And then if you go deeper, I don't know if anyone wants to jump in, but if you go deeper into Zenz, he's unheard of basically before 2016-17. I was doing some research through some newspaper archives recently, and I saw him pop up in a Washington Post article in the early 2000s as like a German exchange student who was volunteering with some sort of feed the homeless soup kitchen type thing. And so he, prior to his sort of newfound stardom as like international anti-communist rock star, he was teaching at a seminary, an evangelical seminary that thinks like Christianity is the only truth in Germany. And his previous like sort of high mark in scholarship, aside from some writing on Tibet, was this book about the end times and like how sort of like the end times of the world from an evangelical Christian perspective. And he interprets the entire like geopolitical phenomena of the 20th century and like he offers his predictions of like the future course of the world and international relations through the lens of the Bible. And like he compares
why all believers will not be raptured.
Yeah.
With his father-in-law, who's this far-right evangelical preacher in Minnesota named Marlon Silas.
Yeah. And Zenz, at that time, like some of his biggest political causes are about how like gender equality and so-called tolerance thinking and anti-discrimination legislation are like manifestations of Satan. And he's really raging, it seems like, on the restrictions on the ability to spank children. He talks about the importance of spiritual spanking, which Max asked him about. Scriptural spanking. Sorry.
I don't know if it has anything to do with like the spirit cooking, like Podesta was into.
Well, really quickly, I want to point out that there's a commonality here between this kind of worldview where Adrian Zenz, the leading so-called fake expert on Xinjiang, who also fancies himself a fake expert on Tibet, he opposes gender equality just like Falun Gong. I mean, his ideas are actually really similar to one of the other main anti-China groups, the Falun Gong, which is also based in the United States. They also expressly oppose gender equality. They oppose interracial relationships. They oppose modern science. I mean, it's really a commonality linking a lot of these extreme anti-China forces.
Yeah, definitely. Like in the piece that just came out this week on the Wipeout China incident and the gun club that the U.S. government funded National Endowment for, not National Endowment for Democracy, Uyghur American Association runs, they've partnered up with the Family Research Council in the United States. And their president spoke on a panel alongside a number of anti-China dissidents, like Bob Fu, who heads China Aid, which is funded also by the National Endowment for Democracy and is this evangelical conservative Christian. But the Family Research Council is designated as a hate group by SPLC, the Southern Poverty Legal Center.
Law Center, yeah.
Law Center.
I mean, it's a group whose president has asserted that homosexuality leads to pedophilia. I mean, that's where they're at. So,
and its current vice president is, I believe, Jeff or John Boykin, who was
General Jerry Boykin.
Jerry Boykin, who's former Undersecretary for Defense under George W. Bush. And he basically goes on about how Islam is evil and how there should be no mosques in America, and Islam shouldn't be funded by the First Amendment, shouldn't be defended by the First Amendment. So yeah, there's definitely like this common thread of like religious, ultra-conservative forces in the West that are really latching on to this sort of save the Uyghur Muslims faux concern. And yeah, it's really like diving into like the connections between different groups and their stated views on various issues is like pretty mind-boggling. It's like an endless source of I don't know, bewilderment.
Yeah, it's amazing that this narrative, which has taken in large swaths of liberal America about kind of being the new Nazi Germany, being genocidal, is largely the product of someone who is essentially a Christian fascist. I mean, who has said that for Jews to be Jews have to be perfected before they can be raptured by converting to Christianity, and that they will be burned in a fiery furnace by God in order to be perfected. Those who won't will be damned to an everlasting lake of fire, presumably along with Uyghur Muslims. And every single paper he writes tracks with the narrative that the US government seeks to exploit against China. So, Ajit, that you wrote about his forced labor paper, which equates basically Uyghur children or Uyghur families receiving free childcare while they go to work with child separation, forced child separation, like the kind we've seen on the US-Mexican border. And he constantly in his papers conflates China's successful poverty eradication policies with genocide. In his paper on forced sterilization, which me and Gareth just ripped to shreds, which it was pretty easy to do. And I can talk about how Zenz has subsequently retracted his major findings in the paper in direct response to us. He shows like elderly Uyghur families in Xinjiang receiving checkups at an outdoor free medical clinic, the kind of which, you know, you'll never see around here in Southeast DC. And these are people who are old, like they can't have children. And he writes in the caption below, this is another example of forced sterilization and surveillance of the population. Like everyone in line is over the age of 70. I mean, there's not even like some Sarah Palin person who can have children in their mid 50s. It's like old folks. And Zenz still frames this as they're about to get like IEDs in them. So you can see, I mean, he wrote in his book, Worthy to Escape, that Satan, the Antichrist, represents the fall of capitalism. The Antichrist represents socialism. He obviously opposes birth control. And so you can see the direct connection between his religious ideology and the findings and conclusions which he comes to through statistical manipulation and sheer propaganda in his papers, which are then foisted on the liberal public through the middleman of corporate media like AP. The Intercept quotes him, the New York Times. I'm sorry, not the Intercept. Democracy Now!, as you can see, had him as a guest. So,
no, the Intercept quotes him as well.
The Intercept, sorry, I should know. The Intercept.
And they declared that there's a genocide going on
without any sourcing.
It's unbelievable. Have you ever seen anything like this before? Where, I mean, we saw with Darfur, there was talk about a genocide, but I've never seen such like universal acceptance of this. We're talking about, that's a serious claim, a genocide. That's mass murder. And everyone just lines up to accept it. And what I just keep thinking about reading your work, Ajit and Max, is that you couldn't get away with this if they were accusing a white country of this, a European country. This only works because Asians have been dehumanized, and because this is coming from a face of this, you know, white Caucasian Christian, and it's palatable for a racist imperial culture. And I've never seen anything like it, where this nutcase, his inventions get an airing.
He's like
get not just an airing like a wide acceptance in mainstream media, but even as the picture shows, places like Democracy Now!, The Intercept, everyone just accepts it.
I want to point out really quickly that when Democracy Now! Had him on, this is honestly false. They called him an independent researcher. That's not true. He works for the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Yeah. Now, if they don't want to say that, then don't have him on. But you can't lie about your guest and say that he's independent. He's not independent. And then there's one other point I want to point out here, and that's that even the State Department's lawyers, they understand, like Aaron is saying, and as Ajit said, this is a very serious charge. And when you accuse a country of genocide, that has a very specific definition in international law. Foreign policy, which has ironically been pushing this genocide narrative and nonstop Cold War propaganda in China, they published an article acknowledging that Biden's State Department lawyers concluded there's not enough evidence to prove so-called genocide in China. So while they're publicly trying to have their cake, they're also eating it too. They're claiming, for political reasons, they're claiming that China is the new Nazi Germany, is committing genocide. Well, they're actually quietly, internally acknowledging that there's not enough evidence to actually prove.
And also,
that
if you really believe that this was genocide, as so many people on Twitter and elsewhere purportedly do, wouldn't you be doing more than just
on the railways and stuff? You know,
go there, like put your body down, like go to the Chinese embassy, you know, do protests. Like the thing is, no one actually believes this. It's just become a cultural thing to say China's committing genocide. It's like the cool thing to do right now. Yeah, genocide. Why not? It never goes along with it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things, really good things that have been mentioned. So, like on the point of like getting away with it, not being able to get away with it, we're seeing like an example of that right now, where AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is saying it's bad faith if you criticize the migrant detention camps. Which we have footage of and we're seeing. Whereas when you see a picture of like a classroom in China, it's like a dystopian brainwashing of Uyghur children to destroy their culture. And I think it's really like disturbing the extent to which this double standard exists. And there's definitely a racist aspect to it. It didn't begin with China, and we see these sorts of double standards being accepted with so many countries across the global south. But like back on the Zenz point, like Zenz, it's pretty safe to say, is basically an ultra conservative who would espouse the same sorts of views towards women's rights to choose and abortion that we see so many discredited ultra conservatives do in the US and Canada and across the West. And he's basically the source of the sterilization campaign. So we see how these ultra conservative figures on like issues of abortion will make the most like distorted propagandistic claims. And Zenz is basically doing that about China, and all these sort of liberal progressives are accepting it as, oh my goodness, this is a atrocity and we need to talk about it. And like there's just so many examples of like the issue in Xinjiang, of course, is incredibly complicated, but there's so many examples of just yellow peril racism, where it's like, oh, a picture of something Chinese or Chinese text or some like old people getting public healthcare checkup, that's IUDs. Like in the forced labor story that I wrote, in ASPI's report, the Australian Strategic Policy or Strategy and Policy Institute, they cite these Chinese language media reports, which talk about young Uyghur families being able to get it. Basically, the way it sounds is basically like a jobs program where they get a position that pays them more than minimum wage, and with which they're allowed to send basically remittances back home to improve the life of their family. That's ASPI's own sources, but they're just able to link anything, and there's a huge language barrier, and there's this huge like cultural fear around China that you're basically able to say, point at them and anything's accepted.
Yeah, and what's happening now with the forced labor narrative, and then the what is it? The dirty cotton, the unclean cotton narrative. And you've got the AFL-CIO, the AFL-CIO pushing this campaign really heavily to get companies out of Xinjiang, is that they are disemploying. I don't know if that's a word. It sounds like some academic word, but basically they're eliminating jobs worked largely by the Uyghur population in an area that has been traditionally undeveloped, and forcing them to go longer distances to find work, or just returning to unemployment or working for much less money in like the local market. So this is sanctions by other means. This is it's a way of sanctioning China and attacking a rural population that has traditionally had nothing, and reversing a lot of the development that's been taking place. It's also giving cover to companies like Nike that have pulled out, which use sweatshops around the world so they can morally posture and say, we're no longer participating in this genocide. And I think the goal is actually to increase poverty in Xinjiang, to increase desperation, just as the US is doing in Venezuela or Syria, for example, under this false conception of how you encourage a popular rebellion, that if people are hungry and poor and starving, they'll blame the government and they'll rise up, or they'll be like they will establish fertile soil for, radicalization and recruitment from the outside. And that's the process we're seeing take place. I don't think it's clearly not going to work. It's making Chinese citizens more nationalistic. And we saw Skechers, which has a factory in Xinjiang, actually conduct its own independent review and find that the claims, apparently they reviewed Zenz's work and they found that it was rubbish. And as I mentioned before, Zenz has retracted major findings in his study that was cited by Pompeo as the basis for the genocide designation after my and Gareth's piece, and then the discovery panel I did with Canadian peace activists last week.
With Daniel Dumbrell.
Yeah, with Daniel Dumbrell and others. But yeah, I mean, and then there's the issue of genocide. I think that, we did a tribunal, a people's tribunal in Brussels called the Russell Tribunal after the Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip, which was just brutal. They were targeting entire families in their homes with targeted missiles. I was in Gaza with Dan Cohen, and we got to go in the rubble and talk to people who had lost 20 family members while they were asleep. There was just endless rubble, just absolute destruction. 551 women and children were killed. And then you have the Gaza Strip itself just under a blockade, where the Israeli military, I mean, this has been reported in Israeli media, uses mathematical calculations to determine how many calories each resident will receive each day. They said that they want to put them on a diet, but not allow them to starve. I think, we debated whether Israel was committing genocide. We had a jury of notable figures. We had an expert on genocide testify, and we couldn't come to the conclusion because we just took the designation of genocide so seriously. But I think in the current environment, we could have just flagrantly thrown that accusation around, because Israel meets the standard so much more clearly than China does. It's so obviously targeting a specific population, which it has been ethnically cleansing for 70 years in order to establish an ethno-supremacist state. And what's happening here is that the campaign about Xinjiang and Uyghurs is targeting Muslims in the West. And I believe, because I see a lot of the Uyghur groups working with pro-Israel groups, just as the Darfur campaign was exploited to give pro-Israel groups and the Israel lobby moral cover, this is also being used to weaken the Palestinian solidarity movement and to fracture Muslim American solidarity with Palestine. We saw CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, have a protest with the Uyghur American Association, this group you just wrote about, Ajit. Rushan Abbas, a former Guantanamo Bay interrogator, was helping lead this protest outside the White House last week. I haven't seen CARE do any protests against the Biden administration policies on Palestine. Maybe I'm missing it, but they're totally focused on this Uyghur issue. And obviously, there's probably, because there's more attention to it. But this is just sad to see an organization like this leave the traditional causes of its base and advance the State Department's interests.
It works beautifully from an imperial perspective, because instead of people mobilizing around issues that they can actually impact, like Gaza, like if Americans were mobilized around Gaza, can make a huge difference. it can change.
Our government doing it.
Yeah, it's our government.
The Chinese government doesn't care what we say anyway.
Yeah, and of course, and then also it has people. It displaces concern onto places that we're responsible for and the places that we're not responsible for and that are not comparable. I've never been to Xinjiang, but I have been to Gaza, and to even, I mean, you know, again, it's true I haven't been on the ground in Xinjiang, so I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something, but the idea that Palestinians in Gaza are treated better than Uyghurs in Xinjiang, I just think that sounds insane to me. And I say that with not having the benefit of being to Xinjiang, but it just sounds it sounds even insulting actually to fathom. So, but that's the beauty of it. It enrolls people into being concerned about places that they have no impact over and that they don't even really fully understand, into not being concerned about places that are happening right in front of our eyes with our active support. And that if we could mobilize, we could stop. And I think that's, as you indicate, that's part of the point.
Well, I also want to point out really quickly, Max alluded to this, but what's fascinating is how reporting on the Uyghurs before around 2019 has all been erased. And of course, we know that the United States, that the U.S. military was actually attacking Uyghur extremist groups in Afghanistan because there are Taliban and Al-Qaeda allied Uyghur extremists fighting in Afghanistan. And there was also a very interesting article in 2017, and here I have it up. This is in the Times of Israel, you know, a clearly a hardcore Zionist newspaper. And the title is "Uyghur Militants in Syria Look to Zionism as Model for Their Homeland." And this is a reprint of an AP Newswire. So this is the Associated Press writing. And it talks about how since 2013, thousands of Uyghurs, etc., have traveled to Syria to train with the Uyghur militant group, the Turkestan Islamic Party, and fight alongside Al-Qaeda, playing a key role in several battles against the Syrian government of President Bashar al-Assad. But the article says, but the end of Syria's war may be the beginning of China's worst fears. And it quotes Ali, a Uyghur extremist fighter, saying, quote, "We didn't care how the fighting went or who Assad was. We just wanted to learn how to use the weapons and then go back to China." And then the Associated Press article continues, "Uyghur militants have killed hundreds, if not thousands, in attacks inside China in a decades-long insurgency that initially targeted police and other symbols of Chinese authority, but in recent years also included civilians. Extremists with knives killed 33 people, these are Chinese civilians, at a train station in 2014. They also bombed the Chinese embassy in Kyrgyzstan in September of 2016, and in 2014, they killed 25 people in an attack on a Thai shrine popular with Chinese tourists." This article also goes on and talks about how they consider Israel, the ethno-state in Israel, to be a model for the ethno-state that they want to create inside Xinjiang. So, by the way, what also happened last year, this article points out that they were fighting with the Turkestan Islamic Party. Well, what happened last year is that the Mike Pompeo State Department delisted the TIP, the Turkestan Islamic Fighting Party, the Turkestan Islamic Party, as a terrorist organization. I mean, it's still recognized as a terrorist organization, by the way, by the European Union, by even U.S. allies like the United Arab Emirates, by Russia. So the
UN Security Council.
The UN Security Council, which the U.S. also voted on because the U.S. has veto power, the U.S. after 9/11 voted to recognize the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM, which later is now known, it changed its name. It's now known as the TIP. The U.S. government and its allies have recognized this group as a terrorist organization for many years. It's known that it's very closely allied with Al-Qaeda. We know that it was fighting alongside Al-Qaeda in Syria. And last year, what a coincidence. Last year, Mike Pompeo and the U.S. State Department unlisted it as a terrorist organization, which opens the path for the U.S. to legally support this Al-Qaeda-allied terrorist group. And this leads us also to your article, Ajit, which is about, this isn't even just speculation. We know right now in the United States that the U.S. is backing an extremist far-right Uyghur group that is that's armed and is trained by former U.S. Special Operations Forces.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that could be said about the East Turkestan Islamic movement that you brought up, but and I'm hoping I'll have a piece to the Gray Zone soon about that, the delisting of by the Trump administration. But in a couple claims, just to briefly touch on before I move on to the gun club and the new article I just wrote, Kazat Altai, who's the president of the Uyghur American Association, invokes Israel as a sort of parallel to justify his political desire for a separate nationalist state in Xinjiang called East Turkestan. And he also regularly invokes the issue of Palestine to basically browbeat Muslim countries or Muslim majority countries for not supporting his struggle. What I wrote 2 weeks before this recent article was about the recent report that the quote unquote independent legal report that characterized Chinese policy in Xinjiang as genocide. The co-partner with the New Lines Institute, which is one of the think tanks that authored it, is the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, which is founded by Irwin Cotler, who's basically the Canadian head of the anti-BDS movement. He's been tapped by Trudeau to help implement the political push to basically criminalize BDS and equate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. So it just highlights like the extreme like absurdity of people who the very forces that like are working to outlaw boycott, divest, sanctions campaign against Israel are advocating basically the exact same campaign against China. But moving on from that, on this March 21st Stop Asian Hate rally, which took place after the tragic, disgusting, murderous rampage in Atlanta, which killed 6 Asian women and 8 people in total. I believe it was a reporter with the Washington Examiner who recorded this drive-by caravan that's shouting, "Wipe out China and F China." And this got like a lot of traction on social media and a lot of condemnation, and there seemed to be like clashes where like the anti-racist demonstrators were sort of unhappy with the drive-by, and the Washington Examiner reporter claimed that they had denounced the drive-by as racist. And then the UAA, the Uyghur American Association, which is funded by the US government and has been for nearly 2 decades, came out and admitted responsibility, but said they were totally misrepresented. They condemn all forms of bigotry and stand with all forms of all victims of racism. But if you actually look into this organization, I talked about how they partnered with like right-wing organizations like the Family Research Council. They also partnered with Republican lawmaker Ted Yoho, who's like an ultra-conservative racist who voted against legislation or a resolution which would have made lynching a federal hate crime. He was one of only 4 lawmakers to do that. He was once caught on video telling a Black constituent that he's not sure if the Civil Rights Act is constitutional. He voted against a resolution condemning various forms of bigotry because it included anti-Muslim discrimination. And so you have not only these sort of very dubious links, which sort of raise questions about how anti-racist this organization that called to wipe out China is, they also operate this gun club and post on social media. They've now closed a number of their social media pages. But this gun club, not only does it dress in what look like either knockoffs or trying to be wannabe US military fatigues, they have US flag patches on them. And a lot of the times they're holding assault rifles and they're training with ex-special forces, individuals and institutions who say their primary sort of function is to help train US special forces and US military before they deploy. So these are the people this Uyghur American Association, peaceful, non-racist human rights group is working with. And they're sharing like the most obscene right-wing like content on their social media.
Ben, I don't know if you can show any of the social media posts.
If you scroll down, there's a screenshot of them. Like one of the more like obscene ones was they're pretty gun obsessed and seem to share the same views of a lot of like the right-wing pro-gun movement in the US. And they're comparing Central American migrants to MS-13 as like a play on like AR-15. And they're saying, oh, Democrats need to defend, I wish Democrats would defend my gun rights as much as they defend MS-13, which is like such a racist sentiment. And the founder of this organization, he features in pretty much all of these pictures. He's Farouk Altai,
right there,
who's
right
the
there.
brother. He's right there on the left, wearing the British flag in a skull format, a fitting picture. He's the brother of Kuzat Altai, who's to his right, who's the president of the Uyghur American Association. They're both the nephews of Rebia Kadir, who's basically now she's in, I think, later life, and she's transitioning away from like the head of the leadership. But in the early 2000s and late 90s, she was basically the international figurehead of the Uyghur sort of international exiled community or separatist movement. She really helped mainstream the movement with the Bush administration in the early 2000s. And there's in my previous reporting for the Gray Zone, I go into that. And the broader organization, which is called the World Uyghur Congress. But they are her basically nephews. And
well, sorry to cut you off really quickly, but you should also mention that until she went into exile in the United States and began working with the United States government, she was the richest woman in all of China and the 6th richest person in all of China. So, I mean, she's basically the ultra rich billionaire Uyghur oligarch, and she represents the Uyghur capitalist class that wants to break with China and have its own independent separatist region where she would be the ruler. I mean, she would be the oligarch who would dominate that independent state.
Yeah, I mean, like there's New York Times profiles on her which talk about how, literally in quotes, like I'm paraphrasing, but they're like her activism against the Chinese government forced her to give up her Audi 3 villas and far-flung business empire. That's like near exact what the U.S. what the New York Times describes her as. I'm not sure, I don't want to get too far afield, but this isn't like a coincidence. Like these people trace their basically political inspiration to the privileged sector of Uyghurs within Xinjiang, who during the civil war in the lead up to the Chinese Revolution had aligned with the Kuomintang, or the nationalists, which were backed by the US against the communists, and they lost. And they've never forgiven that. And they went into exile in Turkey and have been trying to basically, like the founding father, who the World Uyghur Congress, which is the parent organization of the Uyghur American Association, which features in all these gun club pictures, they call their founding father this individual, Isa Yusuf Alptekin, who spent most of his life in exile in Turkey after they lost the Civil War. He wrote letters to Nixon, praising him during the Vietnam War as standing up for all oppressed people and urging him to take on their cause. So they have deep roots to this sort of right-wing anti-communist movement or sector of people in Xinjiang who sort of see themselves as having been dispossessed by the communist revolution and are trying to get back what they think is theirs.
And so, you know, when we look at this group, it's first of all, it is a separatist organization that claims to speak on behalf of all Uyghurs, even as it is essentially calling for sanctions on the place where most Uyghurs live, and sanctions specifically targeting that place. That reminds me so much of the right-wing Venezuelan exiles based in Miami and Washington, D.C., the right-wing Cuban and Nicaraguan exiles, and in some senses, the Bandera movement, which has captured a lot of the Ukrainian exile community in the U.S. and the organizations they founded, pushing for more hostility with Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union. And the U.S. just consistently weaponizes these immigrant communities against their geopolitical targets. So there's nothing really unique here. What is notable is that, you know, along with us, you're one of the few journalists actually writing about it and exposing it. And I think it's had an enormous impact because it shatters the narrative of just a peaceful human rights movement that's liberal. That's my view of why this is partially broken through. And at the same time, you know, we've been labeled genocide deniers, which is a way
now
of
pro-CCP.
Yeah.
Now pro-CCP influencers, according to Aspie's new report.
Yeah.
Well, we should talk about that because I found that so hilarious. As just an observer of this subject, I don't go too deep in it. I don't go too deep into it, except I read you guys. And so here I see this report that is coming out against the gray zone. So I was thinking, okay, well, maybe they're going to challenge some of what Ajit or Ben and Max have written. So, you know, I'm looking forward to reading it. And what it is this report, which, by the way, is put out by this think tank, ASPI. It's Australian. It's funded by the Australian government, the U.S. government, the British government. It even takes money from Israel. I just learned today. It's taking some money from Israel. Yeah, that's in their thing. And also progressive champions like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. So they put out this report about the gray zones reporting on Xinjiang. But it's not about our reporting. It's about how many times a Chinese official has shared it on social media. That's the report. It's like multiple pages, and they go through instances, and they have screenshots, and someone's gone to the trouble of putting up a graph and like a table showing an example of a Chinese diplomat sharing a gray zone article. Not even a Chinese diplomat, a diplomat from the World Health Organization sharing a gray zone article. And this is all supposed to mean something. So now just the act of sharing an article, if you have a Chinese passport and you work for the Chinese government, that's a nefarious act. Not for a second, not even in a sentence, do they actually take issue with anything that the gray zone has reported. And that is a microcosm of what we face on almost every issue, basically, where no one ever actually challenges what we say. They try to take away our right to say it and try to smear us as dupes of a foreign state.
Yep.
Yeah, Aaron, I think you put it perfectly. Take away our right to say it. The reason I think they're resorting to this absurd smear tactic is because they're trying to use the same tactics that the Alliance to for Securing Democracy also did, which is that basically if you do factual journalism, but it's shared by Russian government officials or Chinese government officials, the Alliance for Securing Democracy has smeared us and others as state-backed as part of a campaign to censor us in social media. And I think they don't care. They don't care that what we report is factual. My personal view, and I'm interested in what you all think, but I think they wrote this report because they're trying to make the case to social media corporations that they have to censor us because we are being promoted by the Chinese government, supposedly.
Yeah, they're trying to create a sense that there's coordination there when we really don't have any contact with any Chinese officials. I don't like fire off articles to Chinese officials. It's just public, and then they can do what they want with it. I'm pretty sure our articles are shared much more fervently by anti-war activists in the West, but that doesn't fit the narrative. But I agree. And, you know, you mentioned the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which actually did a preliminary study for the State Department-backed Coda story attack on us, on how many times our articles have been shared by Chinese officials. It appears that they did that study just for that article, which shows to me State Department coordination. The co-director or co-founder of the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which was itself funded by many of the same groups that fund the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, USAID, and so forth. The co-director is Laura Rosenberger, former Hillary Clinton advisor. And if you watch the footage from Anchorage of the Chinese Foreign Ministry facing off with Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and their crew, you'll see a woman sitting to the left of Tony Blinken taking notes while they're getting dressed down and for being just complete hypocrites talking about human rights. And she's Laura Rosenberger. So the former head of the Alliance for Securing Democracy is now the key China advisor to Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken. And so I think it's no coincidence that we're seeing this aggressive attack revived against alternative media for puncturing their narrative with factual journalism.
And this takes us back to how we started this live stream tonight, talking about the impact and the goals of Russiagate. We were bombarded for the last 4 years with this relentless American disinformation campaign that claiming that Americans are the target of a Russian disinformation campaign. And we've been told constantly the way to protect our democracy, to defend ourselves, is to guard against so-called foreign disinformation. And so this is the playbook for that. It's to build up panic about foreign disinformation and foreign actors, supposedly who have the power to brainwash millions of Americans and sow chaos and, lead to the black, fuel the Black Lives Matter movement, as if that is even a bad thing. But so trolls, so memes and social media have been given this mythical power, which is then used to scare people into justifying censorship on anything that is deemed to be linked to foreign disinformation. And that's exactly the playbook that they're trying to do here against the gray zone. We've seen it constantly. When I testified on the Syria issue, on the OPCW scandal before the UN Security Council, the British ambassador cited my Twitter feed as a reason why I should not be listened to. And what he was referring to is Charles Lister, this pro-war lobbyist, put out a tweet where he was citing this thing from the Senate Intelligence Committee where they claimed that, as I was talking about before, this guy Konstantin Kilimnik, who's a Paul Manafort associate, is really a Russian spy. And the Senate Intelligence Committee report claimed that Kilimnik had this secret Twitter account. And then people looked at that account and they saw that one of the people that he follows and has retweeted is me. So they were trying to draw this connection that somehow because this account retweeted me, that I'm favored by Russian spies. But I mean, one of the problems with this is that they never showed any evidence that this account actually belonged to Konstantin Kilimnik. And I have strong reason to believe that it doesn't. And regardless whether it does or not, the guy's not a Russian spy. There's no evidence that he is a Russian spy. So it's just it's a disinformation campaign.
It's the shabbiest tactic. They did it to me when like my book Goliath came out, and like David Duke's website wrote like a semi-favorable review of it that also attacked me because the book was not anti-Semitic. And so they said, he has been endorsed by David Duke. And like Eric Alterman took it to The Nation. Max Blumenthal endorsed by David Duke, the Free Beacon. And David Duke, I don't think endorsed me, but he always runs around endorsing people that are a threat to the establishment. And I just developed this conspiracy theory that like David Duke's being paid just to endorse people that are a threat, which wouldn't fit with his MO because he's a complete fraudster who's been actually jailed for embezzling his own followers. But the point is, you can't control who promotes you, and you can't control who retweets you. And I think our audience is pretty diverse, but it generally situates itself within the left. But we can't control it. And, why should I be ashamed if Chinese officials are reading us? We get retweeted and tweeted by officials from around the world. Rafael Correa, who's the former president of Ecuador, tweets our stuff out. Am I supposed to be ashamed of that? I've interviewed him, but are we supposed to be ashamed that we have influence? And why are they always calling us fringe when they're pointing to how much influence we have around the world? They always say
people are so irrelevant. I'm going to spend half of this 30-page report writing about how evil they are and how much of an impact they're having.
How much money went into calling us fringe?
It's also a white supremacist mentality, as I was talking about before, in terms of the ability to lodge these insane allegations against China. There is a presumed white supremacy here that somehow a Chinese person or diplomat retweeting us is bad, but you wouldn't say that if it was a German or
you were retweeted by a Chinaman.
Yeah, I mean it's so normalized, and it's fascinating to look at, and it's fascinating to see how captive these people are to it. They themselves are captive to a major disinformation campaign, whether they're witting or not, or they're just useful idiots. But it's really striking, and it's to the point where now a weapons industry government funded think tank can put out a report about retweets.
Yeah,
policing retweets, and think that that's significant, as if it means something.
Well, it's also about generating media coverage, because it went straight to the Wall Street Journal, who basically wrote a press release for it. And I don't think this is the end. I think there'll be more substantial attacks, potentially from a publication like the New York Times. There's going to be, I bet I can predict like a magazine style piece on, quote unquote tankies, like the trend of tankies, just to like frighten off boomers, like in the New Yorker or the New York Times Magazine. I could totally see that. But, the narrative is being broken apart. The establishment and corporate media, the foreign policy and establishment and corporate media is shaken because they have a sense of inviolability. The American empire is in a state of decline and is growing increasingly extreme. And so I just expect much more of this. And we're just going to continue to do the factual reporting we've done and be as independent as we always have been. And I don't know, I feel like we should wrap up, but if Ajit wants to.
Well, yeah, I'll pivot to Ajit. I just wanted to make a point really quickly because Aaron mentioned it. Just the racist dehumanization of China. I mean, look at how mainstream corporate media outlets are referring to China's diplomats now as wolf diplomats. And they're talking about China's wolf diplomacy. Why are they saying that? Because, as Brian Becker pointed out, and we really should stress this point, this was not stressed in the media. When there was the first meeting between U.S. and Chinese diplomats under the Biden administration, it was the United States that invited China to Alaska, which is a U.S. state on U.S. territory. I mean, it was colonized, but it's U.S. territory. And they invited China. And then, as Brian Becker pointed out, immediately at the beginning of the meeting, Antony Blinken just railed against how evil China is and how it's committing all of these human rights abuses in the first ever diplomatic meeting where China was invited by the United States. I mean, that was an incredibly impolite act. You would never see
it'll be the only meeting. Sorry to interrupt it. The Chinese delegation asked for another meeting and Blinken refused. I think this will be the only meeting and that it was designed for that.
Yeah. So the U.S. basically invited China into a trap, opened the meeting that they invited China to by attacking China. And then when China's diplomats responded, they still responded in a very diplomatic way, but a little more aggressively than normal to defend themselves. Now they're being called wolf diplomats because China or any other country is not allowed. Wolf warriors. They're not allowed to defend themselves.
No.
What they're supposed to do is just take all of the attacks, and if they ever dare to slightly slap the hand of Uncle Sam, they're called wolves.
And because they are, and because they are, that's why they're being increasingly attacked now. I don't think this is just because of China's rising economic power and how it threatens U.S. supremacy. They've also been increasingly assertive on the world stage. And I saw this firsthand at the UN when I testified about the OPCW cover-up. It was China also trying to stand up in this meeting, much to the annoyance of the Western or the North Atlantic diplomats there from the U.S., Germany, UK, France, and saying, no, we want to hear this and we want to respect the independence of the OPCW. And I could see the annoyance on the face of the North Atlantic diplomats. And I know just from my limited understanding of the UN that China has not always been historically in the last few decades this assertive and this in the face of the U.S. And so I think it's that shift and them actually trying to uphold international law and counter U.S. hegemony that we're seeing deceptions like we're seeing around Xinjiang.
Yeah, Ajit, I don't know if you want to.
No, I would just echo the comments that you've all made. Like, it's definitely at the heart of it. Like, at least this sort of Twitter discourse dimension is this freak out about losing control of the narrative. Like, it's not as firm as it has been. And like this discourse about wolf warriors, if you Google it, it's been going on for like the past several years. This term's being invoked, and it's basically, how dare you speak out? Like, this is not your place. And the whole freak out about the meeting in Alaska, where it was like, oh, look at the way this Chinese diplomat's talking to us, and it's so there's like people so offended, and these absurd tweets going viral about like, there's that like, I don't know her name, but she's some American commentator going on about, me and my friends are laughing about how China's behaving on the world stage. All of us are laughing about it. And I think at the heart of it is this fear of like losing control. And that's why you're already seeing it adopted, like that open letter on Syria that had the version that included the gray zone, called it the mysteriously funded gray zone. So you're already seeing this sort of, it's being adopted by the narrative that, like, I think ASPI is trying to, like, it's the independent think tank that releases it, and then the New York Times writes a secondary report on it, and then it just starts getting accepted as like, oh, there's independent scholarly investigation, that there's some mystery here. And so, yeah, I think it's only going to ratchet up, but I think it's a sign that the work that's being done is effective.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely feel like a sense of accomplishment here when no one disputes any facts we publish. And, you deserve a lot of credit, Ajit. And we're getting, I thought one of the funniest parts too about the ASPI report, it was like attacking us, like saying Chinese diplomats did not retweet the gray zone prior to some point in 2019. And it was like, you all didn't turn on this narrative until that point. Like no one knew who Adrian Zenz was until that point. He just came out of some like hole or some like, he came out of like, they've just like summoned him from some evangelical seminary in the hills of Germany. And he was like, just brought down
Sound
to
of music
reap
style.
havoc. Yeah. He was just like up there yodeling and whatnot.
My question though, do they think these things through? Do they think these things through? Couldn't they have thought of a better figurehead than a far-right, anti-Semitic, evangelical bigot?
Couldn't they have fact-checked
on this point, though? I mean, comedy aside, I actually think it's important to keep in mind what, aside his insane evangelical extremist views, what else was he established for as supposedly an expert on? Tibet. It's not a coincidence that Adrian Zenz got his academic career started focusing on Tibet, supporting the Tibetan secessionist movement. And let's not forget, what we're living through now is very similar to this campaign that was very big in Hollywood. You know, Richard Gere and all those people were really big making propaganda for the Tibetan secessionist movement. They're all friends with the Dalai Lama. They all were like into like these weird Dalai Lama Buddhist cults. So this isn't necessarily new, but I think actually it's more effective than the Tibetan secessionist art movement was, because they were like trying to get all these crappy 90s bands to raise money for them. And like student activists.
Yeah, they got the Beastie Boys. The Beastie Boys.
Max, did you go in high school to the Free Tibet concert in DC?
No, I was never. I just thought it was weird. I didn't think about it.
All my friends bussed across North America from Vancouver, BC, and I remember at the time, they're like, "All right, you know, I don't know. I didn't know, but it's so fucking funny. They find something every time. It's so funny.
I was going through this old footage of the first when Jiang Zemin came over to sign a trade deal with Bill Clinton. I think it was the most favored nation trading status, and it was still taking place in the shadow of Tiananmen Square, which is another issue we can talk about. And Tibet took center stage. But actually, the day before the summit, a Uyghur exile was brought to Tom Lantos's Human Rights Commission, which was the same commission that brought Naira, the Kuwaiti ambassador's niece, to lie about incubator babies being killed by Saddam Hussein's forces. And the Uyghur exile actually talked about, forced sterilization and all of these issues that are now popular today. But Tibet took center stage, and they had this concert outside the White House where Adam Yauch from the Beastie Boys was on stage with Richard Gere. Bianca Jagger was Amnesty International spokesperson there, and they were all denouncing the trade deal. And then you saw this coalition of senators that really reflects the same coalition we see today against China, which brings left and right together. Like you see the Bannonites, and then you have like the Dylan Ratiganites, the sort of all these, faux economic populists united in this new Cold War campaign. And then you had Paul Wellstone doing a press conference with Jesse Helms, the neo-Confederate racist from North Carolina. So it was the same then as it was now, but Tibet was the human rights cause, and they hadn't really worked up this situation with Xinjiang. And that was because, at that point, the separatist movement hadn't fully developed. you had a lot of foreign fighters coming back from Afghanistan to Xinjiang, and they were bringing their tactics and Wahhabi ideology with them, which led to the rise of ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic movement, that carried out these violent attacks and then brought a kind of surveillance regime and a crackdown between 2014 and 2017. So that's kind of why I think we're seeing Tibet replaced with this issue.
And Max, just to situate this, so we're talking about the late 90s, early 2000s when it comes to Tibet, right?
Yeah.
And so what is happening in reality then? The U.S. is sanctioning Iraq, killing, untold numbers of people. Madeleine Albright saying the price is worth it. Clinton is bombing Iraq, setting the stage for the invasion.
Bombing Yugoslavia.
So those are, and of course, the occupation of Palestine is continuing. Israel is expanding its settlements in the West Bank with full U.S. support. So those are the real crimes that are going on throughout this period. And then what are impressionable young Westerners motivated to do is mobilize for free Tibet.
And Darfur. I remember neighbors of mine growing up in DC would come up to me and be like, "What are we going to do about Darfur?" Yeah. And I said, "What the hell is Darfur? Where's Dar 5 and Dar 6? What are you talking about? Like, where is this coming from?" And they're like, "We have to do something now," because they were like Washington Post subscribers and listened to NPR. And
Darfur got really big after Iraq and also really big after Israel invaded Lebanon in the summer of 2006. All of a sudden, we're supposed to care about Darfur all of a sudden. And when in reality, and no one even talks about it anymore because it's served its purpose. It's lived out its use. And same thing with today. Now we're talking about Xinjiang while we're pick any place in the world, Syria.
The U.S. extorted $300 million out of Sudan, and they got taken off the terror list, which was just an obvious tool of extortion.
Yeah.
So,
and now Sudan is normalizing with Israel.
So that's over. It's like, the wolf warriors, like if China could find some Boris Yeltsin to like drink his face off and sell off the country to U.S. corporations, then you wouldn't hear a word about genocide again. It would just be over.
Yeah. Yeah.
It would be like, he'd get the Nobel Prize nomination with like whatever the next white helmets are, wherever they turn up.
They tried that with Liu Xiaobo, but he died.
Yeah. Liu Xiaobo, he was a great progressive, right?
Yeah.
Who supported the Vietnam War and Western colonialism.
And I just want to say about Syria quickly. We talked about it before, but the sanctions, the lack of attention to it, this way to immiserate a country even further, destroy a country without dropping a bomb or sending in weapons or sending in soldiers, just by crippling the country, by blocking it from the financial system, by keeping it away from its own resources, its own oil and wheat. And we don't talk about it. Try to get a mention of it in the U.S. media. There's never an article specifically about the U.S. sanctions in a U.S. mainstream paper like the New York Times or the Washington Post. It's always like Syria is going through some problems and the sanctions get like a passing mention buried at the bottom. And
it drives me insane. I mean, because we were talking actually about like the allegations of forced sterilization because the birth rate has gone down in Xinjiang, like it's gone down across China because China is developing and they give away 1 billion free condoms a year, for example. They emphasize family planning across the board. That's what like liberals in the US, I think, support. But then there was this article in the New York Times on Venezuela and women not being able to access birth control. And it mentioned American sanctions in 2 words. The rest of the article just gave you this sense that Maduro is taking it away from them because he's this patriarchal, masculinist scumbag who's incompetent and he just wants people to be mired in poverty and having too many kids, as though. And of course, the real reason is U.S. sanctions tank the economy, destroy the economy, deprive the government of assets to give out free birth control, and no one can afford the birth control that is for sale in the stores. That's the story. And why can't they tell that? Because it's just not allowed in U.S. corporate media. You're not allowed. This Time reporter, Carl Vick, who I actually knew in Palestine, he was one of the better ones. His wife used to work for Human Rights Watch, I think, and he had some sympathy for the Palestinians. I like showed him around a West Bank village once. He just went on this propaganda tour of Colombia and did this absurd press release in time for Ivan Duque and his little narco mafia that's overseeing hundreds of killings of social leaders just this year alone. And then he said that, you know, they're heroes because they're taking in these Venezuelan migrants and they're treating them so well when actually they're living in hell in Colombia. And the Venezuelan migrants are fleeing an incompetent authoritarian. There was no mention of U.S. sanctions anywhere in that article. And it's just like, Maduro's just like this dumb guy. That's the way they make it out. Like, oh, I don't know what to do with, like, he's Idi Amin. Let's
manage my own economy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's totally not the case when you can watch my interview with Delcy Rodriguez, the Venezuelan vice president, who's overseeing their economic reforms and attempts at managing the economy under sanctions. These are not stupid people. I mean, this is someone who is actually herself a really well-established scholar who comes from a revolutionary background. But that's the portrayal in the U.S. press. It's completely racist in that it just falls back on the accepted racist chauvinism of the way that Americans are supposed to perceive third world leaders without actually explaining the context that they find themselves in, which has been imposed on them by us. That's one of the most frustrating things. I think I talked about it before on one of our live streams about how I actually, at a Maduro press conference, I got to meet the hack pack that was down in Caracas, that's like based there. And they're not journalists. They're like stenographers for the State Department posing as journalists. And one of them approached us, me and Anya and a friend, Zoe Pepper, who does really good work of her own. We're just standing around at People's Dispatch. It's a very worthwhile site. We were just standing around waiting for this press conference to begin. And it was like taking forever to begin because everyone had to get COVID tested. Like the only times that I've ever had like COVID tests forced on me, by the way, were in Venezuela. Anyway, so we're standing around and they put out like a table of snacks for all these people who want the government to be like Maduro to be dragged through the streets by the back of Guaido's motorcycle. And they're all like feasting off the snacks and standing around. And then one of them comes over to us and is like, new in town? Like, what are we at, like happy hour at Studebaker's or something? Like, what the hell is new in town? Like a pickup line. And then he starts like grilling us, like, how did you get here? You know, he's basically like trying to say, like, did the government send you here? And like, I was like, no, we flew on our own on like this Avior airline and got stuck in Dominican Republic for a night. And then I'm like, you know what? Fuck this guy. Why do you never, you know, why am I even trying to be nice to you? Like, why? And I was just like, why do you never, ever write about sanctions? Like, why do you never talk about, you know, if you wanted to run a whole campaign about how sanctions is destroying the civilian population in this country, you could actually help change U.S. policy. Yeah. I mean, you write for a major publication. I'm not going to name him, but he writes for a publication that's just like one of the worst. And he was like, you know, it's just so hard to tell where sanctions affect people. And it's impossible to know. And, you know, what it's really about is corruption. You know, I mean, you got this, the government's just like, just giving away cash to its cronies. And like, he just gave me some story that I'd never heard of about like Maduro giving like bags of cash to people. I've heard that story from other journalists about Aristide, by the way.
Of course. Yeah, of course.
Like he had rotten cash in his safe when they.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I was just like, you motherfucker, like, this is what you actually believe. And he comes from Washington, D.C. and he's like, yeah, I was raised there. And like, he comes from pure privilege. I don't know, for all I know, his family's from the State Department. But this is the mentality of the press corps, the international correspondents. And they just, so that omission of sanctions, which is the worst human rights crime in the world right now, is it underlines all their coverage and allows them to blame the victims.
And it's everywhere. So in the 1990s, Democracy Now! Did amazing coverage on the impact of the sanctions on Iraq. It stood apart. Now we try to find a DN segment on the sanctions in Syria. Zilch, nothing.
Yeah, the only mention in The Intercept of the Caesar sanctions on Syria was an article by, you know, the star reporter Ida Chavez, who's just been brought on at The Nation, which attacks Code Pink for opposing the Caesar sanctions. And it was like a press release for the Syria regime change groups.
And that was in 2000. I just checked. It was in 2019. That's the last time The Intercept has covered the sanctions on Syria 2 years ago before they were even passed. And now the country is approaching famine, facing the harshest sanctions in the world, and our supposed leading adversarial sites can't even manage an article or a segment about it.
Yeah, I mean, how do people think that Madeleine Albright was pressed to make those repulsive comments that it was worth it to kill
journalism?
500,000 Iraqis? It was Leslie Stahl at 60 Minutes, who's a complete tool, but it was because there was this ongoing massive campaign that was putting so much pressure on the Clinton administration that the corporate media felt compelled to ask about it. There is no campaign now. I mean, the peace groups are like starting to do something, but they've never been weaker. And of course, they won't mention us.
Yeah, on this note of, I just wanted to bring this up. I had this. This is an incredible graph made by a friend of ours, Alan McLeod, a great journalist, and it just shows this. I mean, you were talking about these stories that are ignored by corporate media, and then they suddenly appear, like Tibet or Darfur or Syria or Libya, and then they just disappear, never to be heard from again. This graph to me says everything. I mean, this March was the 10th anniversary of the NATO war in Libya, which destroyed the state of Libya. And 10 years later, there's still no central government. And this graph from Alan McLeod shows that every once in a while there's a spike, depending on whatever policy is. But in 2011, there was this massive spike of interest in Libya and human rights. And then it just died. As soon as NATO intervened and destroyed the government, it was just basically just never mentioned again.
Yeah, mission accomplished.
And that's the role of the media. I mean, that's exactly what it does. And that's why there's no discussion of the sanctions in Syria. You know, they're never going to mention the effects of U.S. sanctions.
It kind of reminds me of the AIDS crisis in the 80s when it was just allowed to fester because who was it killing? Gay people, people of color who were being mass incarcerated. And when the corporate media and the establishment, the political establishment, decided to finally make a big deal about AIDS, who was the poster boy? It was Ryan White. They finally found a white boy, a white kid from the suburbs whose
last name was White.
Literally his last name was White. And he got a blood transfusion and got AIDS and died. And so they were like, I remember the Ryan White story there were all these TV movies about him. And I was supposed to like freak out for Ryan White. Like I was supposed to fear now that I could get AIDS, but gay people were just being rendered completely invisible when they were just, it was thanks to the work of ACT UP. I mean, anyone who's watching this now, I always recommend this documentary made by Sarah Schulman on ACT UP, which was the radical, LGBTQ group, mostly of LGBTQ activists, of people who had AIDS or whose family members had AIDS, and they basically they besieged the Reagan White House and local lawmakers and did radical direct action to force the government and the NIH to invest in studies. I mean, they forced like Fauci to turn around. He was like initially their enemy, and they put this campaign and their community on the map. And, their slogan, which I saw everywhere around DC when I was young, was silence equals death. It was such an effective slogan. And it's the same kind of slogan we could apply to sanctions. Sanctions equal death. They don't equal death for, for our neighbors in the US, maybe, although many people in the US are kind of sanctioned in a way. The people been lining up for food during the pandemic, but sanctions equal death for millions and millions of people around the world who have been rendered invisible by our media, who are just besieged. They have no way of accessing the world financial system or food or water or medical supplies. It's because of the deliberate decisions made by the Biden administration, the Trump administration, whatever the next administration will be. I would like to plaster DC with signs that say sanctions equal death. This should be the human rights cause of our time.
One quarter of the global population is living in a country under U.S. sanctions.
That's
one third, according to a Venezuelan analysis.
On this front, I want to recommend to anyone who hasn't read it, Max wrote a piece about Richard Nephew, who has recently been appointed to be an official in the Biden administration as the deputy envoy to Iran, so working under Rob Malley. And Max wrote this piece about Nephew's book called The Art of Sanctions, which Ben turned into a graphic called The Art of Sadism, where Nephew brags about his role in crafting the U.S. sanctions, especially on countries like Iran. And he boasts that he ended up hurting civilians, raising chicken prices, depriving people of meals around the holidays, depriving people of the ability to fix their cars because they couldn't import the right parts.
He bragged on a panel at Columbia that he increased unemployment rates to make things sticky.
And so this is the sadist. This is the sadist who's now working in the State Department. It's why I don't call it the State Department anymore. I call it the sadist department, because that's what they do. They inflict misery on foreign populations who live under governments who don't submit to U.S. dictates.
Yeah, I mean, they're the hate department, and you could call the U.S. ship of state the pirate ship of state, because it's literally carting out Syrian oil from the oil fields it occupies and selling it off possibly to Israel through Turkey. I mean, that's pretty well established. Yeah. Looting Venezuela's foreign assets. I mean, it's just like the ultimate world looter. But Nephew, this guy, you look at his Twitter account and it's pictures of him with his family and his children, and they're, on their porch with Biden signs, and they're just like living in this liberal neighborhood. I mean, I think I know the neighborhood they live in, and it's like, you walk through that neighborhood, everyone has Black Lives Matter signs and signs that say, like, we believe in science and hate has no home here. And that stuff, they're so nice. He loves his children. Tony Blinken, he said the other day, that when he thinks of Syria, he thinks of his 2 children. And I said, and in Samantha Power, when she testified for her confirmation for USAID chief, which is, basically, global destabilization arm of the State Department, she tweeted a picture of her children at her hearing. So they're all invoking their children. They love their children. They love their children just as much as the Nazi doctors that Robert J. Lifton, the famous psychologist, who he interviewed for his book by that title, The Nazi Doctors. These are people who compartmentalize, or they embody the psychological tendency that Lifton called doubling, where they're very good family people. At night, when they come home, they genuinely love their children. And by day, they go to work and they're absolute monsters, and they slaughter people. They kill people with the stroke of a pen. They are, as I think Anya called Nephew, little Eichmanns.
Yeah, she did.
They are the worst.
And then he blocked all of us.
Yeah, then he blocked all of us. But I mean, that term is, a very apt term for these figures. And I said to Tony Blinken, if you treated your children like you treat Syrians, then you would rob them at gunpoint, deprive them of food and water and medicine, and you would be jailed for child abuse.
Child murder.
Child murder. Yeah, he's a child killer. That's why I call him Tony Blinkskrieg. I don't know. I mean, we're going to up to 3 hours. I don't know if Ajit is got anything else to say, but I gotta get off here, and, like, as George W. Bush said, I gotta put food on my family.
Yeah, just like the sort of like contradiction between like the hip dad in the like neighborhood with the lawn signs, while implementing and helping design this brutal, murderous sanctions regime, is like, it's at like the heart of a lot of like what we've been talking about, is like this blindness, which is like, I would say like directly rooted in like it's directly connected with like the legacy of like colonial minded paternalism, where it's like, it's related to what Aaron and Max mentioned about corruption, and like how everything can just be passed off on corruption. It's like the notion of they don't know how to conduct their own affairs. They're like the colonial sort of ideology towards like indigenous peoples is like, they're inept. They don't know how to tend to the land. They're not cultivating the land. We need to come in and save them. And so they're able to completely erase their own murderous actions and their own responsibility, and just put it on, domestically, there's like, this guy is giving away money to this person, or this person is giving bribes to this person. And they completely write themselves out of the story.
Yeah, completely. And I think you pointed out there's like an interparliamentary committee on China.
Oh my goodness. Okay. I'm looking forward to writing. This is going to be maybe one of the more fun articles to write about. I'm sure you've all seen on Twitter, they seem to do a lot of their activity, the Interparliamentary Commission or Interparliamentary Alliance on China, like this very clear Cold Warrior alliance being set up of basically lawmakers across they say they're international, but I went through their listed membership of lawmakers, and aside from some lawmakers from U.S. like staunch military ally Japan, 92% of the members were white, and it was just like it's just so obvious, like the racial like yellow peril Cold Warrior ideology that's like at the heart of this.
Yeah, and like you look at the countries, like they always are like 52 countries recognized Juan Guaido. Like they all got together independently and decided, like, we like this Guaido guy. We like the cut of his jib. Kind of reminds us of Obama. It's like, no, they're just like the white countries that have like feasted on the carcass of the global South traditionally, and the U.S. tells them what to do. Like that's, you just look at the map and you're like, those are the white countries, and like a few of their like Trump's apprentices in Latin America who are like represent the white elites of their country.
And Haiti, which got bullied into selling out the country that was giving it subsidized oil and loans. Yeah.
I mean, and look at what Moise, how many people voted for him? He's in a lot of ways, he's like Guaido. He like maybe 16,000 people in total voted for him. He's like the most hated man in Haiti. He couldn't get elected dog catcher. That's who recognized Guaido. Who's this other guy in Uganda that the NED tried to like, because they got sick of Museveni, and so they came up with this guy Bobi Wine, and he did a seminar recently with Guaido. It's like, it's just so pathetic. Like they just anyway.
Well, we're 3 hours.
We're at 3 hours, so I'm gonna peace out. If anyone else has anything to say, you got to do so without me.
I think we can end it here. A lot more we didn't even get to, but we'll get to it or another one. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We didn't get to all the super chats, but we really appreciate them. We appreciate your support. Let's everyone just say some final words of goodbye and get out of here.
Go, Ajit. You want to conclude with what you're working on and where people can find your work?
Yeah, you can find my work at The Gray Zone predominantly, and you can follow me on Twitter at Ajit X Singh. I'm currently working on looking into the source of a lot of the increasingly cited testimonial evidence about the alleged concentration camps in Xinjiang and the Xinjiang victims database that's operated out of Kazakhstan. And hopefully we'll have something on that soon.
Yeah, great. And I'm really looking forward to it. And again, Ajit, I mean, your contributions have been absolutely enormous and made a major impact. And I think, the most important thing to me about it and about doing this work is just correcting the record, correcting the historical record, and just putting it out there for people who are skeptical and who refuse to be intellectually captured by this massive state disinformation campaign run through U.S. regime media. So yeah, find out more at thegrayzone.com. We've got some incredible investigations coming this week that I've been working on. I mean, like really hard hitting stuff. And I don't want to telegraph our punches, but I'm really excited about what's to come this week. And you'll see, because you'll see various freakouts from different like sectors that all connect around their mutual supportive empire.
Yeah, and I'll add that, we talked for 3 hours now and we hit a lot of different topics, but I think it went well. It was very organic. There were a few topics we didn't get to, and hopefully we're going to have another stream sometime soon, including the Matt Getz scandal, which is crazy. It also involves Iran and the CIA agent who was allegedly caught in Iran, Robert Levinson, and the Israeli government is allegedly involved. So, I mean, We'll unpack some of that because a lot of that's not being discussed in major corporate media outlets. And then another issue that we didn't get to talk about is the latest developments with the OPCW Syria scandal. Aaron has been really covering that extremely well. I mean, he's the only journalist, well, not the only, but really one of the only journalists covering this beat. And that's also related to his reporting on Bellingcat. And Bellingcat was caught. I mean, so we'll have another stream soon looking at Bellingcat's extremely shady behavior. And then there's another.
I'll have more reporting on that soon, where we not only caught them publishing fraudulent material, but we also caught them having someone outside of Bellingcat author their material and write their questions for them, which shows that they're even more of a fraud than we thought they were. So there'll be more on that soon.
Yeah, and then there's another scandal that so we are going to have a live stream again soon, and in that we're also going to talk about how a Western government contractor ran a sting operation to entrap a British anti-war academic to try to discredit his work, exposing the massive corruption of the Syria regime change organization funded by Western governments with tens of millions of dollars. So, I mean, just more, not only exposing just the hypocrisy and the immorality of a lot of these Western regime change organizations, but also how they have been profiting on the destruction of an entire nation. While they're accusing us of insanely, without any evidence, they're falsely claiming that we are the ones backed by boogeymen governments. They're the ones who have been raking in millions of dollars, profiting on the destruction of Syria. It is so cynical and so disgusting. So we're going to have another stream soon to talk about all of that.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks, Ajit.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Well, you were listening to Moderate Rebels and, the Gray Zone as well. If you want to support the work that we do here, you can go to patreon.com/Moderate Rebels, and you can submit questions for our live streams and get other content. And definitely check us out. We have a lot of other interviews coming soon, and we have other parts to this live stream discussion, discussing Syria, discussing the Hawks and the Biden camp and Ukraine. And we want to thank you, not only for your support, but anyone who listens or watches this show. We will be back soon. See you next time.